All right, so with that, we're just going to jump into things here. So in today's webinar, we're going to show you primarily two things, right? So I'm going to start things off with a quick demonstration around one of Esri's newer products called Tracker for ArcGIS. This is Esri's newest mobile application and how it can be used as a data source. And then later on in the webinar, Michael will show you how to take a real-time data source, i.e. My tracking application, and start acting on it in real time. So to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and jump to my desktop here. And we're going to talk a little bit about where data comes from. So utilities specifically, but most organizations generally today are just absolutely inundated with data in a way that they've never been before. And what I mean by that is the ability to data capture has grown exponentially, not just in the last decade, but in the last just few years. With the advent of things like smart devices and home sensors and metering networks, all of this data that is being pumped into your enterprise is absolutely flooding most of the utilities that I work with. And now, the more data you have, generally the better insight into your business you can get. However, that's only useful if, one, you're able to create that insight, two, share that information, that insight out, and three, take some sort of an action on that data, right? So I'm going to show you a few of those concepts right now, and then we're going to really drive it home with Mike's part later on. So the first thing I want to share with you guys today is the newest mobile application available to Esri customers called Tracker for ArcGIS. Now, this application is a little bit different than our previous mobile applications in the sense that there's actually two versions of the app. There is a manager dashboard web app, and then there's a mobile kind of end user smart device application itself. And so we're going to start with that end user application, and then we're going to take a look at the managerial dashboard. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this actually means for a utility and what it's doing behind the scenes. So to get started with, I'm going to go ahead and share my mobile screen here. Michael, are you able to see my screen?
Mobile device, no.
Okay. I think I need to stop sharing here. And we'll try one more time. Yep, there we go.
Yep, I can see it now.
Perfect. So I have up on my screen a couple of the apps that are put onto the Apple and Google Play application stores by Esri. Today we're going to be focusing on Tracker specifically. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. So this is Esri's flavor of a lightweight mobile tracking application. Now, what do I mean by that? It's really specific to the smart device, right? We're not tracking people, we're not tracking trucks, we're tracking the device. Now, what that allows you to do is actually track a lot of things, right? So if the device is on the person, you're tracking the person. If the device is in the truck, you're tracking the truck. So different than AVL or these other systems, it really gives you a higher level of agility when you talk about tracking, depending on what you want to track and how you want to track it. Now, what I mean with that last point, how you want to track something, that's really up to the organization to set standards for, right? But it's also up to the individual user themselves. So here we're looking at the mobile app. I pull it up. This is the screen that I see. I got one big button to enable tracking. So with one single click, I begin tracking and my day starts, right? Now, what I can do beyond that is if I dive in, I can see kind of where I've been walking around my house this morning, where I went out and got mail, but I haven't really left my house today. I don't imagine a lot of people have, given the current pandemic. However, as I zoom out here, I'm going to actually see my tracks from yesterday when I did a grocery store run on the other side of town to get us some nice, big, long tracks to look at. So this is useful to an end user for any sort of survey or inspection that they're doing that involves them walking down multiple streets, like a like a leak survey for a gas company, right? Where you have to walk down lots of different roads within a subdivision, and you don't want to do a lot of backtracking, right? So it's really hard to remember, okay, did I walk down the street yet or not? This kind of keeps track of that for you and allows the end user to come in here and see historically their tracks from the last 24, 48, and 72 hours. Very simple. And beyond that, the user can actually set their own schedule. Now, this is something I was saying earlier can be set up by a manager or an administrator, but the user themselves can also set their own schedule, because just as important as it is to be tracked while you're working, it's important not to be tracked when you're not working. And a schedule helps facilitate that. So you're always kind of in control about when this application is sending data back to the enterprise. I'm going to go ahead and move out of my mobile application because that's really it. As far as what Tracker does as an end user mobile application, it really just allows tracking with a single click. So it's a very user-friendly application, and then allows them to see where they've been historically up to 3 days prior, right? And that's how this application was designed. It was really meant to be mobile friendly in the sense that it is a lightweight, battery efficient application. It just runs in the background with very minimal user interface to it. But then what it's doing is it's creating a live stream to your enterprise, to your ArcGIS enterprise or ArcGIS Online organization, which brings me back to my home screen here. So this is where I started my presentation today. And I did that to kind of get it into your mind that this portal interface is really that funnel which all data comes into. Now, whether or not the end user knows it, when they sign into that Tracker application, they're signing in to this portal, and this is where their data is going. So if I sign in as my manager, I'm going to be able to see all of my tracks very easily. So if I go to this if I go to this applications button here, I'll see all the apps that I have credentials to be able to access. But then I have this one called Track Viewer. Now I've already pulled this up and zoomed into Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where both Michael and myself live. And you can see where we are because we're logged into the application. But you're not going to see any tracks because up here I have a query set to just show where we've been in the last 8 hours. So both Michael and I, of course, have been observing self-isolation measures and have not really been moving around the city too much. However, we have been going to get groceries. So if I expand our query to look at the last, let's go 36 hours, it's going to query for all of the records related to our two users, all those tracks, and bring them here into the map. Now, this is a very simple web app. This is really meant for a manager to be able to see all the crews for which they're responsible for. So if I click on myself here, I'm going to get a nice color. If I click on Michael, I'll get another color. So if I have a lot of crews overlapping, or a lot of personnel or vehicles or things that I'm tracking overlapping, I can use this to be able to really see between them. Because if I have them all turned off, all their tracks are going to look gray. All of them are going to be on top of each other, which can be useful for some forms of analysis. But if I'm just looking to confirm that Matt was able to make it to work safely, or Matt observed the speed limit as he was driving, I might just be focused on Matt tracks, right, to answer that question. So if I zoom in here, I'm going to see the accuracy of this mobile application. Now, I'm not using this with any externally connected GPS device, although it can use one of those. I am just looking at the mobile device's GPS. And so as I zoom in here, I can actually see, if I wheel over the tracks, the direction I was heading. So I can see myself coming home and myself heading out. If I click on one of these, I'm going to get a lot of information. So each of these points here are the actual record that's being used to construct this line. So at this point in time, my device had a 79% battery. I was in a vehicle traveling 55 miles per hour heading northeast, and I can see the accuracy associated with that capture, right? So I know to what level of certainty I have to assess whether that point, that individual point, was accurate or not. So as I'm creating these tracks, I can actually exclude less accurate readings to create a more accurate line. Now, I keep referring to these as tracks and lines, but what's happening behind the scenes is each and every single one of these breadcrumbs that Tracker is dropping, and they drop rapidly as the application is connected to the internet and on. each of those points is a record itself with all of that data that I just showed. If I click on this again, being captured in each individual record. Who I am, when I was there, and then a bunch of device data, including the charge, how fast you were going, your bearing, accuracy, and other variables that even aren't listed here. So Tracker's really capturing a lot of information about the user, right? Or more specifically about the device that application is on. Now, what does this allow you to do? Well, in the actual apps itself, you saw the end user could kind of control when they were being tracked and see where they were historically. And then as a manager or a foreman, I can come in and see all the crews that I am responsible for and where they've been, you know, way past 3 days. I can set a query for, you know, as far back as I want, even going into a custom mode here and individualizing, you know, a particular month or year, or day, segment of time, and have that displayed here because I'm archiving all that data. But everything that I've done so far, all this out of the box functionality within the applications themselves has all been historically minded, right? Even though I'm using a real-time location app and there is value in being able to see Matt Baber is currently at his house right now, what am I really doing? I'm not really doing anything as far as leveraging this real-time data, because as long as it's connected to the internet, this data is real, right? It's the last known location of Matt and Michael, right? And if I go disconnected, that data just syncs to my device, or rather caches to my device, and then syncs up when I re-enter connectivity, right? So that data is historical itself. So how do we leverage real-time data? How do we take action on this data as it's coming in? Well, ArcGIS has a lot of ways to really, you know, analyze real data and even act on real data. So to lead us in that discussion, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Michael Hersheimer, who's going to take what I've done here, kind of that next step. Michael?
Thank you, Matt. All right, let me share my screen. All right, Matt, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Probably. And it's the outage map or the dashboard.
We're seeing the track records dashboard.
Yep. All right, one more time. All right, so this here is taking the tracks that Matt had just talked about and put them into an operations dashboard. See here, we've got over 574,000 records, and this is just with a few members of our staff with a tracker turned on. So you can imagine how much bigger this is going to get if we have field crews of 10 or more out there. So what I want to be able to do is just see the tracks that are within this red polygon, which we are defining as a dangerous customer area. Could be where a customer has been hostile, either verbally or physically towards one of our employees, and we want to know about this. So we're going to use GeoEvent to read in these tracks real time and then copy them into a different layer so that we could do analysis and notification at a later time. So the end result would be ultimately looking something like this. Same map, same tracks, but just within the red polygon. All right, so let's talk about GeoEvent. So this here is the workflow that is going to be used to take input from tracks, do a spatial query to see if we fall within that red polygon or geofence, then do some processing, and then actually write it out to the feature layer. So rather simple workflow, and if you're familiar with Model Builder in ArcGIS Pro or ArcMap, it's very similar to that. But before we go into real detail about this workflow, we're going to talk about how to set up GeoEvent. And we're going to start off here on the site. Now, for those who are familiar with ArcGIS Server or ArcGIS Server Manager, ArcGIS GeoEvent Manager looks very much the same look and feel. Tabs on the left-hand side and upper right, and a bunch of bunch of screens to configure and maintain your environment. And what I'm showing here is GeoEvent 10.8. All right, so on the site, we're going to start off with our data stores. So GeoEvent can only be installed in ArcGIS Enterprise, but it can connect to services in both ArcGIS Enterprise and ArcGIS Online. All right, so once you've got your data stores set up, we're going to go over to connectors. And this is how you bring data in and how you take data out. So for our inbound connectors, for our example, we're going to be using the first one, polling and ArcGIS Server for features, but you've got about 20 other options as well, from polling to receiving from endpoints to subscribing to Kafka topics to watching folders for specific files to be dropped in. And if these out-of-the-box inbound connectors aren't what you're looking for, you also have an SDK to create your own, but that's a topic for another day. For outbound purposes, we can add a new feature. We can publish and push JSON out to websites and WebSockets. We can send text messages, emails, and instant messages, and we can also write files. Okay. Next, we're going to go over to GeoEvent definitions. This is where we read in your feature services and get the schema of it. It's as easy as clicking on the import button, finding the layer that you want to bring in, and hitting import. Now, I've already got this one built, so it gives me an error message. But as you can see down here at the bottom, let's click on this. We'll click on this tracks, which is from Tracker itself. It gives me the schema of all the fields that the Tracker application is populating. So this will end up being our input connector. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be writing pieces from tracks into this within GeoEvent's definition, which will then be used to populate our feature layer. All right, okay, the last piece we're going to talk about is geofences. So this is a polygon layer, which has a category, a name, and this is where we're going to do our spatial analysis against. It's as easy as importing it from a single, you can do it manually using the import button, or you can set up a synchronization rule, which allows you to bring in data on a set interval. Could be hours, minutes, or seconds. Now, for this example, we are using a static feature layer consisting of polygons that we defined as dangerous customers, but it could be something, hotspots for, let's say, COVID, or substations in your service territory, or any other structures in your service territory. All right, so we've got, this is the setup. Now we can actually go in and start looking at the service itself. So at the top, we can see that this service is actually started. It has processed 2,500 transactions so far. And out of those 2,500, 305 of them have been written out to that new feature layer. On the left-hand side, we've got controls to connect our processes and also align them to make them look good. We can create new elements. We've got a listing of all of our inputs that are defined in this GeoEvent server, and then a list of the existing outputs. And also, we have access to our site definitions. So if you forgot what they were, you can just click here and it will pop up a new window so that you don't have to toggle back and forth. Anyone who has used GeoEvent Manager before 10.8 release knew that you couldn't, this functionality was not there. You would have to go back and forth between tabs, between windows. So this is a nice product enhancement that they just put in. All right, so this is our input. We're going to look at the properties of it. It's coming from location tracking. It's using the GeoEvent definition of tracks. It's refreshing every 10 seconds. And under advanced settings, I have it set up just to limit it to just to process those created by myself or by Matt. All right, then, so we're gonna read the input in. And if we were to do a connector to, try that again. To that, so if I were to go directly from my input to my output, then I would have 2,500 email or 2,500 records being inserted directly, which is not really what I want to do. Nor is that. Oh, all right. So we've got our tracks coming in. We've got a spatial filter here, which is checking to see if the geometry is inside that dangerous area geofence. And if I were to, we can look at the properties here. So it's saying if the geometry is inside any of the geofences, that can specify any ones that are predefined. And then I can say, search for all of them or a specific one. All right, and to create a new filter, all you have to do is just drag it onto the canvas and start filling in your information, and you're done with that piece. All right, so so it'll do this spatial filter. If it finds that it is within that geofence, it's gonna move on to the next part. We're gonna do some data mapping, which is we're gonna take the information from Tracker, the created user, and the geometry, and we're going to store it into another definition, which we're going to use to map to our N feature layer result. Then we're going to move on to geotagging, which is actually doing that point and poly query, getting the name of the geofence and then appending it to our staging definition. So this will get us that it's dangerous customer / whatever we've named it in that area. Then after that, we're going to do some calculations or some string manipulation to get the geofence category name. Do some more data mapping to get all that information out from the staging definition, which is this one here, onto our target, which is the our new layer that we want to show this stuff. And at this point, I'm going to ask Matt to turn on Tracker, and we're going to see a new piece of functionality that will show us tracks as they come in. All right.
All right.
This is not quite work.
Just turned on. Yeah, just turned on Tracker.
All right. All right, let's try this. All right. All right, and what this is going to do down here at the bottom is it's going to sample some tracks that are coming in, and it should give us the definition of what we are seeing. The hardest part is waiting. All right, there we go. All right, so what we can do is we're going to copy that to the clipboard. I'm going to bring up Notepad. So this is everything that's coming from Tracker. We get the battery percentage, speed, which this one came from me and I'm sitting, so I was correctly going 0 miles per hour, which is very disappointing. And the geometry too. So this is useful for testing to making sure that stuff is coming in the way you expect it to. So we're going to put another definition in over here. And we're going to see if we can get this to come up the way with some information as well. All right, so while this thing is chugging about here, we're gonna come back over to here. So once again, this is our dashboard showing where we are within that GeoEvent, where we've found points within that GeoEvent. And as you can see, we've got Matt in here at 125. So, and this has taken, so to recap what we've shown here is that we took all these tracks coming in from Tracker. We're able to do a real-time spatial filter on a GeoEvent and then be able to populate those results out to a new layer, which then we can then, do some analysis on at a later time. All right, Matt, I'm going to send it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So what Mike actually has done here is taking all of those real-time points that I'm submitting, right? So Tracker submits a record roughly every 15 seconds, depending on how you configure the application. I can do more or less, but it's polling my location that often and creating a record and syncing that record to our database at that rapid of an interval, right? And when you multiply that by a couple of dozen field crews, and then you do an 8-hour workday, what you are left with is a lot of records to try to sift through. So Michael is using GeoEvent to do something rather clever. He's taking locations that are known as hazardous or of interest, and in real time, not retroactively, in real time, doing an analysis that says, if a record or if a track, if a point lands within this polygon boundary, I want to do something. So in this case, he's actually creating a new event that updates a dashboard that says Matt entered this area on this time and left at this time, because he's capturing all the points that I'm leaving within these boundaries. And that allows you to do a lot of things, right? So if this was a hazardous area and I wanted to send an email or a push alert or a text message to field crews that entered an area like that, or if this is an area that has a locked gate and I want to send a message with the gate information kind of as a reminder to be able to access that property to the field crew, I can do that this way as well. So there's a lot of things you can do by leveraging GeoEvent with a real-time data source. And while we showed you, tracks being collected by Tracker for ArcGIS and GeoEvent kind of analyzing and taking action on that data in real time, this can really be applied to a lot of different workflows, right? You can utilize your own automated metering infrastructure. You can use your own existing AVL. You can apply this to things like key fobs used to access facilities. And GeoEvent can run a spatial analysis on that data as it's coming in real time, and most importantly, allow you to take action on the result of that analysis. So, truly matching real-time data with real-time action. And so at this point in our webinar, we'd like to open it up for questions. So feel free to drop things in the chat box, and we'll spend the next couple of minutes here answering them. Thank you for your time. And Nora, do we have the chat open for people to be able to ask questions?
Yes, they should be able to use it.
Great. So the first question that we have that just came in is, are there specific capabilities of 10.8 that are not in the 10.7 GeoEvent server? So yes, I know that there are, but to better answer that question, I'm going to hand things over to Mike.
Yep. So the first thing on the left-hand side, the site settings, you're able to view them without having to without having to close out of this window or bring it up right from this window. You're also able to create new inputs from within this window. So just by dragging your input on, you can pick the inbound connector that is right for you and then go through those steps. Previously, you actually had to go up to the inputs tab and then create it from there. A lot of effort was made to keep the developer, I guess, centered on the GeoEvent service page itself and not having to go from page to page to get over there. Another thing is this sample routes, which I believe is new. Be able to get a sample of the data that's coming in, which is good for debugging. And there's also another option called compare route, which does it compare the results side by side. Now, there's a tutorial on how to get this to work. I played with it briefly. I got it to work once, so it is possible, but that's relatively new functionality.
Thanks,
And
Mike.
I'm sure there's, oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, so it seems like a lot of the enhancements in 10.8 are UI, UX, quality of life kind of enhancements. If you're looking functionality wise, there isn't a lot of difference between 10.7 and 10.8. So if you're waiting on an update in order to get started with this, I'd say you don't really need to. If you already have a 10.7 environment what you want to deploy GeoEvent into, all of that will transfer relatively seamlessly. We actually just upgraded our GeoEvent server from 10.7 to 10.8 within the last 2 or 3 weeks, Mike. I think that's right. And we had created this workflow well before that. And so everything that you've seen here is actually coming over from our 10.7 environment into 10.8. And then the things that Mike pointed out are great for testing and great for building new queries moving forward, but didn't really keep him from building what you're already seeing here today. So the next question that I see here is, oh, I've got a lot of questions all at once. The original stream of data from Tracker is not stored anywhere, only the modified data after the spatial query. No, so it is. So I kind of went through Tracker very quickly at a high level to move into what you can do with sensor data after you're collecting it. I didn't really want to spend too much time focusing on Tracker. But yeah, so there's 2 ways to store data in Tracker, depending on what you are utilizing as your GIS system. So if you're using ArcGIS Online, it's stored spatially in the cloud and is actually self-compiling in the sense that it will remove older records older than 30 days automatically to kind of keep storage costs down. That's because we don't actually charge you to store Tracker data in ArcGIS Online, because as I was telling you earlier, it's very easy to get a lot of it, and we didn't want our customers to accidentally have Tracker left on by even as few as 50 people having Tracker on for just a few days is a lot of records, is a lot of data, and so we didn't want to have customers kind of accidentally have to eat the cost of that storage data due to something so simple as forgetting to turn off Tracker. So the way that we kind of cope with that is any records older than 30 days are automatically removed from ArcGIS Online. However, you can set up an archive to where you cache those data to that archive on a regular basis before they get removed. So that's kind of the workflow for ArcGIS Online. ArcGIS Enterprise stores it in the spatiotemporal big data store, and there's no limits. That's just however you scale your data store to be able to support that massive amount of data that's going to be stored basically in memory there. So what you would probably want to do there is the same sort of archiving method, just so you don't have your spatiotemporal big data stored bloat with all the massive amounts of records that Tracker collects. If that wasn't clear, please follow up with an additional question here. Next question is, in your experience of GeoEvents, is there a best practice as far as starting from the operations dashboard view requirements versus starting from the GeoEvents? And any tips on the approach in an enterprise environment? Mike, why don't you take that one? Don't sound too excited.
I'll try to understand the question here. I don't know if there's so much a best practice, but what we had wanted to do was to eliminate all the noise that was coming from Tracker that was outside of these predefined geofences. So we determined on GeoEvent Server just because tracks was coming in real time. So as they were coming in, we wanted to process them right away, as opposed to having a batch process that would be running throughout the day and trying to determine which records to go after.
Right. Yeah, so I can kind of jump in here for a little bit of this. So yeah, as far as planning what you want to do, I mean, there's pros and cons of either approach. Starting with the business need and then say, okay, we need a dashboard, or we need an alert system, or we need to take action on these incoming events based on certain criteria. That can definitely help you build your GeoEvent. But then the inverse is kind of also true. So taking real-time streaming data, bringing it into GeoEvent, and seeing what's possible will help you identify business needs you didn't know that you had. So we've kind of seen it go both ways, but I'd say probably more often than not, it's starting with this is the business need. We need to know when a company truck exceeds acceptable speed limits or something like that, and then we need to take action on that. So that's something that we've seen done with GeoEvent, and that very much started with a business need and kind of moved into GeoEvent, but that opens up a window for more things moving forward. And then the approach for bringing it into an enterprise environment, my best practice advice would be to have GeoEvent deployed on its own standalone server that is federated with your ArcGIS Enterprise or reads into your ArcGIS Online services, because it can work with both. And the reason I say that is because GeoEvent, you can easily inundate it with a lot of processing, right? So Michael was doing some clever querying to keep it from having to deal with too many records at once, doing the spatial analysis on whether or not a record intersected a polygon. Yes, as shown here. So he's doing some best practices to keep from our GeoEvent processing server from having to deal with too many records. Because if he had pointed, as he showed you, that input directly to the output, every single record would have been processed as soon as it came in. And kind of a funny story, when Michael was setting this up, he accidentally sent himself like, 16,000 emails based on records that I had collected in a few hours. So that's the kind of stuff that can go wrong with GeoEvent. We've definitely stubbed our toes on this a few times. So imagine if you had that server hosting your ArcGIS Enterprise, and all of a sudden it's cranking out to try to deal with that massive amount of spatial analysis on the fly, right? Things are going to move slowly. Users are going to have all sorts of interference with their other unrelated workflows simply because the server capacity is being pointed to GeoEvent, because GeoEvent doesn't care what job you tell it to do. It's going to try to do that job. So you really want to think about how you architect your system, and then in the actual workflow itself, how you can add in some queries and definitions to keep it from having to look at data that it shouldn't have to worry about in the first place. But yeah, great question, because we've definitely run into that a few times ourselves, and I have customer stories that have a very similar veins. The next question here is, how do you get field staff to buy into being tracked? That's something that every utility approaches differently. What we see more often than not is if it is a company device, normally there's already some sort of a tracking service on it, and Tracker can basically go underneath that same kind of, if you agree to have a company device, you agree that we track that device kind of statement that's usually in the contracts of having a company issued device, right? Now, where you kind of blur the lines is if it's a bring your own device kind of program. That's really how your organization contracts that stuff and what your field staff are comfortable with, if they do have a say in that kind of a tracking behavior. Now, I did allude that it's the device that's being tracked, right? So a device that is a smart device like a mobile phone or a tablet or something, or a device that's actually a part of a vehicle, you can install a tracker on, and then it is that device that's being tracked, not necessarily the person. And that kind of distinction matters a lot at a lot of utilities that I work with. And so that's something to keep in mind too. But yeah, it's really just a discussion that you have to have. And it's kind of a relook at what the terms of service for company issued devices are. So our next question is, how does tracker licensing work? Do you need to have as many licenses as users, or can they be shared among users? Okay, so tracker licensing works at the individual level. So if you have a field user or above, you have tracker. Now what you have to do is actually go into your organization and enable that. In ArcGIS Online, it's pretty simple. It's a one button click to enable location tracking, which basically anyone who has a field user type will just have access. All they have to do is go to the App Store, download the app, and then log in with their ArcGIS Online login. ArcGIS Enterprise requires the Spatial Temporal Big Data Store to be set up. And it also requires an additional media installation to get like the managerial web dashboard where you can see everybody and do a little querying and stuff like that. But it's rather painless to get set up. But then it's the same after that. You license your users to be able to have it. They go download the app and then log in with their credentials, and it just starts working. Our next question here is, how are we doing on time? Oh, we still have a few minutes, okay. How GIS can monitor people movement in this area as prevention of COVID. Okay, yeah, so we've been asked this a few times. So can this app be used as like a near contact tracing app for COVID? So it's a tracking app, so absolutely, yeah, it can be used that way. Now the actual workflow is gonna be up to you to kind of distinguish how you want those interactions to work, you know, spatially, of course, but also temporally. Just because two people had overlapping tracks doesn't mean they were necessarily there at the same time. So those are the kind of things you need to think about while you're kind of going down that path of creating a near tracing application out of Tracker for COVID. Is there any way to enforce tracking without requiring user interaction? So supplying a company device to a contractor coming on site and, you know, for safety and management purposes, it just starts tracking. Yeah, so that's something that we're asked kind of often. So yes and no. So there's actually two versions of the app, or two major versions of the app. One is the Google Android version, and then the other is the Apple kind of iOS version, right? So the two app stores have two different terms of service for applications pushed to them. Apple does not allow automatic tracking, period. So the iOS version of the application is a manual push by the end user. They can set reminders in the application, so they get a pop-up that says you need to start tracking, and then they can click on that pop-up and it just starts tracking. But it won't just do it automatically. However, the Android version, last I looked, did have the ability to set a schedule and just actually have it just start tracking. And so that's my understanding. That's because those two different app stores have two different user agreements with how applications that a third-party publisher, Esri, puts applications into those stores. So that's the skinny on that. The last question I see here is, does GeoEvent Server run this dangerous customer geofence analysis on every user request? Or does it try cache results in some way? What happens if the input of a dangerous customer polygon is dynamic? So I'll give my thoughts. Or I was gonna give my thoughts real quick and then hand it over to you. Yeah, because I'm real quickly gonna get out of my depth here. But yeah, so the GeoEvent analysis and the dangerous customer geofences, as we discussed earlier and what Michael has up here, there is actually a query. I'll let him discuss that in a second, his logic behind it. So it does kind of cut down. It's not every customer, it's not every record, it's very specific ones. The caching of the results, I'm going to let Michael answer that. But the real question I wanted to ask here is, or I wanted to answer here is, you know, can these geofences be dynamic? Absolutely, they can, right? In the same way that my tracks are dynamic, the geofences can also be movement, and that's something else GeoEvent can actually do as well. It can, I've seen this done before with weather alerts, where it's GeoEvents being used to create a real-time buffer ring around field crews and their last known locations in the field. So if you have something intersect that, like a lightning strike, so if we say that we want to set up an alert system, so any company vehicle that's within a mile of a lightning strike, I want to send an email or a push notification or a text message to whoever checked out that vehicle. I want to send it to them in real time to alert them to danger, right? I've seen that done before. So it's a real-time buffer around a moving truck, and we're combining it with real-time lightning strikes. So that's an example of that. So to actually walk through the logic of how do you kind of cut down on the amount of records you're processing, I'm going to let Michael answer that.
All right, so first off, GeoEvent Server is going to process every feature that comes into this, that comes in through that service. And it knows nothing of the one before it, and then it knows nothing of the one after it. So as Matt had mentioned earlier, I had mistakenly set up a workflow where I had wanted to send emails at the end. I didn't have any, say, processing in between, and I spammed myself with 16,000 emails. And that was just awful. Now, there are things you can do within GeoEvent, within the workflow. You can set up a event volume controller, which says for some interval only process X amount of transactions. And I tried that with the dangerous customer geofencing, and it sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, depending on how fast the customer or how fast I was going in the vehicle. Sometimes I got through there without any notification coming out. So it's kind of trial and error, and I don't know if there's an exact answer to say, you know, you will always get the results you're looking for if you set this processor to limit it to this. So that's kind of trial and error there. And for caching, I realistically, you know, taking the input, moving it to another, we'll say static feature layer, and then running your analysis there is probably the better way to do it. You know, if you're doing notifications to someone who enters this danger zone, or you probably don't want to send them 50 text messages or notifications, because that itself is distracting, and then they may not see what's going on the road. You know, triggering off of something else might be a better way to do that. But GeoEvent Server can certainly get it down to something that's manageable.
Right, and as you were answering that, I realized I'd actually left Tracker on, so you probably have some emails from me due to just
Fantastic.
sitting here in the dangerous polygon of my house.
Fantastic.
So apologize about that. But I think that was our last question. So thanks again for everyone's time. If you have additional questions, I'm going to share my screen one last time so everybody can capture this. This is Michael and I's email addresses. So if anyone has any additional questions or wants to talk about anything that we covered in today's webinar in greater detail, please don't hesitate to reach out. Love to talk to you. Love to talk about this stuff. And really, just again, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, everyone.